hope you're doing well. My name is Anahita Sen, and I'm a co-facilitator of the M&A Stories YouTube podcast, which is brought to you by Fifth Chrome Business Insights. Welcome to Season 3. The theme of this season is culture and its impact on M&A integration. Culture is one of the biggest challenges that face an M&A integration. And this challenge couldn't get any bigger, as more companies are pursuing M&A based on people and culture. That is why it is important to understand, internalize, respect, and develop a clear plan of action on how to handle culture in M&A. In this season, we will be interviewing industry leaders from across the globe to hear their stories on how they address culture in an M&A integration. So here we go with today's episode.
Hi there. Welcome to another session of M&A Stories. My name is Anirvan Sen, and I'm your host today at Fifth Chrome Business Insights podcast. The theme of the season is culture, and we are being joined by guests from all over the world, coming from different industries and different sizes of companies. Today, we're being joined by somebody who spent years in this space, and now she teaches courses in universities. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a pleasure to invite Mary Cianni. Hey, Mary, how are you?
I'm great. It's springtime here in New York, so the daffodils are coming up. The sky is blue, so everything is wonderful. Thank you for asking. How about you?
It's again very similar. We actually ended up going to this garden, which is like a sakura garden, a cherry blossom garden, and it's in full bloom. It was wonderful. So, yeah, spring can be a good time. So let's start with a brief introduction.
Well, Mary Cianni. I'm here, as you heard, in New York, and currently I'm on the faculty of NYU in a program called the Master of Science in Executive Coaching and Organizational Consulting. So I teach on the consulting side because I bring over 20 years of experience in organizational consulting, having worked with two large human capital consulting firms, Willis Towers Watson and Korn Ferry. So I've also had the pleasure, and one of the things I think is unique about my perspective on M&A is I've not only done it as a consultant, but I was a CHRO at a specialty pharmaceutical company for 2 years, and we bought 3 companies, we divested a company, and then we sold ourselves to a larger pharmaceutical company. And when I was with what started out as Towers Perrin, I went through 2 back-to-back mergers of my own. So I bring to M&A, I believe, not just that external consulting experience, but what it's like to lead M&A as the head of HR, and then going through it myself, which I think is probably the best experience.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm pretty certain we're going to have some very good discussions in today's episode. The theme for this season is culture. So maybe we start with what's your perspective on culture in M&A?
At the core, I think it's at the heart of what M&A is about. And I say that because culture just permeates everything. And we talk about it in that way. But we oftentimes attributed it to perhaps the softer side of what we do. When it really does hit everything, it's how we're structured, it's our processes, it's our norms, it's the way that people do things, the way that they interact with one another. And one of the situations that really brought this home for me is I got called to work with an M&A team that was struggling to do benefits integration. Now, you might think, what does culture have to do with figuring out what kind of health benefits we're going to provide or what the retirement plan is going to look like? But the 2 HR teams for this technology company were really at an impasse. So my team brought me in. I'm a psychologist by background. I have experience doing group therapy. So I think they thought maybe I could help.
Right.
So as we started to uncover what was really going on underneath the surface of these conversations about health plans, it was that the one organization had this feeling of accountability to their employees as families. They were predominantly engineers. They were predominantly male engineers who had stay-at-home partners. And the benefits really took that into consideration. And that was really about the culture, right? That was really about how people perceived that organization as and how they treated their employees. So what they were really talking about with benefits was really the culture and what kind of organization they were going to be.
That's a great example. In fact, what I've seen is more often than not, it's these aspects that create those people issues, the cultural differences, the skirmishes. And what we find is if you look at the entire life cycle of an M&A, while it gets given some sort of importance during maybe the due diligence or period prior to that, but the moment it comes into the due diligence and beyond, it becomes a lot more financially driven, a lot more Excel spreadsheet, business case, cost benefit driven. And culture kind of gets lost, and then it again evolves when there's an employee issue, right? Is that something similar that you have also experienced?
Absolutely. I think it's people will say that the leaders, the deal makers will say culture is important, but what really I think sometimes interferes is not that people don't value it or appreciate it, but the timing, right? There's such speed getting to the signing stage that the financial aspects become more important. But it's going to come up. And there was a wonderful article in the Academy of Management Journal years ago that likened M&A to step families. And I thought that was such a beautiful analogy.
Right.
It reminds me of a close friend of mine who got married, and then everything seemed fine. And then Christmas happened. And in her family, there were these beautiful glass ornaments collected from all over the world. And in his family, there were the ones made by the children, made of construction paper, just haphazardly put on the tree. And it was like a real visible sign of the differences that they had to work through. And they did, and they found that the ornaments can live in harmony. The
Right.
same way, I think if we pay attention to what's going on, that the different cultures can also live in harmony.
Right, right. That's a great example. Why do you think culture is such a big challenge?
Because it's what, if organizations have strong cultures, if they have cultures that really matter to people, it becomes very emotional. It becomes giving up something that was important to me. And I think oftentimes leaders don't recognize that it's happening to them too, right?
Right,
They're dealing with the differences in how they're going to be as a newly combined organization. And they don't focus on their own emotional changes sometimes that they're going to have to deal with. So they ignore what may be happening with people on their teams as well.
sure, sure. That makes sense. And when you look at culture, and you participated in the research that we conducted, right? There were a few things that got called out. Um, Culture being thrusted upon or forced upon the acquired company. Then we found employee dissonance was one of the reasons why there were cultural problems, issues coming up. And yet organizations, time and again, do not know how to handle culture. What's your take? What are they doing wrong?
Because there's so many changes that happen in M&A, I think we become almost immune to resistance, right?
Right,
So we think of that organization that we're acquiring as being difficult, as being challenging. And we don't really understand the human elements of how people go through change.
right,
And that a lot of times what is cultural is also normative, right? It's how we're so accustomed to doing things in a certain way that when we have to change those things, it rubs against us, right? We don't know how, either we think we don't know how to do it, or we're telling ourselves we can't do it, or we don't understand why we have to do things differently. So it really becomes the way that people operate on a day-to-day basis. And it really is about a change process.
right, right. Now, you did mention about some good stories that you have in your arsenal. So maybe you could share a couple in this episode. What were some of those stories?
Well, one of the things, Enron, that really brought home to me the importance of doing things early, but also the importance of starting with the leaders, was an energy deal that I worked on. And this was a US only company, and one smaller company was being acquired.
Right.
And it seemed there certainly were the synergies from all perspectives in making this the right deal. But the CEO, after a while, found that his struggle was really getting his leadership team to work together. And they started to realize, not really knowing exactly what those cultural differences are, but that there was a difference and that
Right.
they couldn't
And this,
integrate.
yeah, and the CEO was of the acquired company or the acquiring company?
The acquiring company.
Right. Gotcha.
So, and they had realized, he had realized in his early interactions with the senior leaders that there was a difference in perspective of what a leader did and how a leader operated.
Right.
So we were brought in to talk to them about culture and how culture could be at the heart of this. And we start out, as we often do, right, with executive interviews. And the executive interviews are really designed to get their buy-in into this culture process. But we started to hear some things from the leaders of the company that was acquired. And one of the phrases that I'll never forget is each of those leaders said, "What our leaders find interesting, we find fascinating." And just the sense of managing up, right? Of always doing what their direct leader wanted them to do. And we started to realize what a hierarchical command and control organization
Right.
that was. So these leaders were used to following orders, following directions.
Right.
The acquiring company didn't operate that way. They had very strong business unit leaders who operated autonomously, who certainly operated as one team, but they didn't wait to be told what to do. They just did it.
Right.
And as we started to uncover those differences, it even led to differences in communications.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is in the command and control organization, they had mastered the art of the cascade. Top down messages got delivered. In the acquiring company that was more consensus driven, they relied heavily on their internet, right? People went there for information. So there was a sense of information wasn't being shared because it wasn't being cascaded.
Right.
And we started to realize that at all levels of the organization, the acquired talent was feeling that information was being withheld because it wasn't coming at them in the way that they expected.
Right.
So I think this just shows that culture really, it starts with the leaders. And if we don't understand the leadership behaviors that emanate from the culture, we're not going to understand how things flow throughout the organization.
Right. Right. That's a great call out. In fact, I've also seen a good few companies where you have one of the acquiring company usually is the one which has got command and control, and the acquired company is the one that's more consensus based or innovative. But organizational structure and leadership styles is an important cog in the culture wheel. Yeah, so that's a great call out. Any other examples that illustrate the challenges with organizational structures or leadership styles that you've experienced?
One of the things that we often see is that on the surface, the structures may seem similar.
Right.
And I might be a vice president in my organization. I'm acquired and I still have a vice president title. But then I realize I can't make the same decisions.
Right.
I might not have the same signing authority.
Right.
And I remember in one company, the managers were telling us, that we keep talking about being decisive, being more risk-taking, but I can't even take my team to lunch without getting approval anymore.
Yeah.
And there was a bit of an exaggeration, but
right. No, absolutely.
You want me to, this new company wants me to be more agile and more responsive, but they put the handcuffs on in terms of what I can do financially. And then again, that just permeates all of the decision-making. So the difference, I'm really understanding what titles mean.
Yeah.
And what are the accountabilities that go with those titles, and how you might need to, if you are making changes or it's different, to take that into account. And don't just assume because I'm a vice president today and a vice president tomorrow that I get to do the same things.
Right, right. So how do companies go about addressing these differences?
It really does start with the leaders. And I had the pleasure and the honor of working with one company that I think really did it right. And
Sure.
they did it right because the CEO believed that culture mattered. And he knew that this transaction was going to be complicated. It was a German company buying an American company. And it was also a shift in their strategy to being more of a specialty pharmaceutical company.
Right.
We spent over 3 months just working with the senior leaders, getting them to really understand what culture meant, really understanding what when they talked about being decisive or being risk-taking or being customer focused, what did that look like and what did that look like for them? And then we had, again, the good fortune to have a CEO who was on top of this, to spend 3 days with their top 200 leaders. And the entire 3 days was about culture.
Right.
And having them experience going through exercises that you wouldn't expect someone who's a senior vice president, like making a film, to really talk about. This is what being decisive looks for me.
Right.
What happened then was they started to feel it emotionally. They started to experience what culture meant. We then spent the next 2 years doing 1,500 workshops led by managers throughout the organization. So there was a commitment of time, there was a commitment of resources, and there was a commitment of money. And I think the other thing that they realized is that it wasn't one and done, that this was going to be a journey, and that they had to really invest in it over the long haul. I think the other thing they did well is to recognize that the process needed to look differently in the United States, for example, or in Asia. It needed to look different in the sales organization versus the manufacturing or R&D organization. So they also spent the time to figure out what's critical across the organization, but then what needs to be differentiated and unique depending on where these employees are sitting. So and what we found was after 2 years, the employee engagement scores had greatly advanced. Shareholder price had greatly advanced, right? So they felt like they were doing well. So that also helps to put things in the right perspective.
Brilliant. Love the example. Just to make sure that I heard you correctly, did you say 1,500 workshops over?
1,500 workshops. Every person in that company went through a workshop. And the beauty of it was that once we got to the director level, we trained the directors and managers to deliver the workshop. So it was relevant and embedded in the work that they were doing as teams. It wasn't just let's go to training, but it really became part of their daily conversation almost.
Right, right. And I'm sure my listeners and viewers would be curious to know what those workshops are about. And then you just mentioned about they were not just trainings, but they were actually workshops, which I would assume a lot more interaction, a lot more hands-on. So if you could paint a picture of what those workshops were all about.
Sure. So we signed it. This company had identified 6 new cultural attributes, but we said, like, you can't roll out 6 at one time, right? It's
Right.
just too much. So let's start with what matters. And I think the first one was about the focus on the customer. Now, again, this is a pharmaceutical company, so
Sure.
it was the sense that they were doing things that were going to have a positive impact on patients' lives. So you're already starting out with the common sense of purpose. But what we did is we created these exercises so that each person, whether they were in finance or R&D or manufacturing, could see the value chain of their work to that direct patient.
Right.
So the managers help them to think through what do they do that led to the next piece of the organization, to the next, all the way to the patient himself or herself. So that was work that the managers that they went through over time, and they really worked with their teams, and it was very interactive. The second one was the attribute was be decisive.
Right.
So again, each manager with guidelines from the top of the house, of course, started to say, where can we take more decisions? Where can we own have accountability for our own actions? How can we get rid of barriers to decision making where we can move faster? So again, we trained the managers and helped them to become better facilitators. There was a lot of support, both through our external consulting team as well as the internal team, and resources and materials.
Right. So these two values that you mentioned, let's do a bit more deeper understanding, a deeper analysis, right? Customer focus, everybody understands what customer focus is, but how did the team narrow down on these two values? Was it something that already existed in one of the companies, either the acquiring or the acquired companies, or were those two values amplified because of the integration?
Yeah, great question. The first one, the customer focus or patient focus, really stemmed from the strategic shift the company was making. So they were moving to be more of a specialty pharmaceutical company,
Right.
which means that they were now dealing with doctors who specialized in things like women's health, as opposed to a general family practitioner.
Sure.
So they knew that they had to get the organization to think differently about who they were in the marketplace. So that was really the driving force around picking the customer focus one, because it was important to understand that the doctors that we're dealing with, the patients that we're dealing with, are different than the general population that we might have sold to before. The Be Decisive one came to the front because that was one of the cultural differences.
Right.
There was a sense that the acquiring company was too slow.
Sure.
And that the company that they were acquiring was used to a more agile, a more faster paced decision making, and understood that that was one of the things that if they didn't get everyone aligned and that they didn't become more agile and more decisive, it was going to hinder them both in terms of the integration, but
Right.
also in terms of what they wanted to accomplish in the marketplace.
Yeah, good to hear. Reflecting on those two values, and you mentioned about 1,500 workshops, that was a humongous effort, right? What were some of the, let's say, constructs around which these workshops were rolled out? Was it one workshop rolled out 1,500 times, or was it one for managers, one for senior managers, one for employees? So maybe give some descriptions, give some details around that.
Sure, they were customized. So as I said, we started out with the top leaders who always had the summit, and we used that summit, the 3 days, to really kick off the project. Once we got to the vice president level, so we did everything by level at that point, and we
Sure.
did it in a way to bring people together, and they were heavily facilitated by us, by the consulting team.
Yeah.
We then started to customize by geography and by function.
Right.
So, in the US, the leaders wanted to be more involved, like they wanted to have a say in it.
Sure.
The sales organization said, this has to look different. We can't just roll things out in one way. Salespeople are different than chemists, right, sitting on the bench. So that's where we started to customize. And the beauty of it was we were a global consulting team. So we also had consultants on the ground in all of those locations who understood the national culture.
Sure.
And also understood the functional culture that they had to deal with. So that's where it became customized. When we got to the manager level, it even got customized at the team level. So the managers started to work and think about how do I take my normal meetings and interactions with my team,
Right.
and embed what we're doing into the work that we do. So it doesn't seem like it's apart from the way that we operate, but it's embedded in the way that we operate.
Right. Now, being decisive, as you said, the acquiring company was not, or was it the acquired company that was not being decisive? Yeah.
Well, the acquiring company was less agile than the acquired company. It was larger. It was based more on a bureaucratic, more traditional model. But again, they were brilliant enough to recognize that the company they were acquiring had cultural traits that they aspired to.
Right. In fact, that was what my question was going to be. So it's a lot easier to try and change the culture of the acquired company, but a lot more difficult, a lot harder to change the culture of the acquiring company. What were some of the challenges? If you remember some interesting anecdotes, what were some of those interesting moments that you faced, both negative and positive? And then for the negative ones, how did you guys go about addressing those?
Yeah, one of the ones that I remember, we always remember the ones where we were out of our comfort zone a little
Right.
bit. Right? So those are the ones that those stories stick in our
Sure.
memory. And I remember we were pitching the design to the management team, the senior management team at I'll call it the German company, the company that was acquiring the US company. And we were talking about the importance of the summit being a very different experience, and that the leaders had to see that this wasn't the same old company anymore.
Right.
And that we had to do things both symbolically and to really shake things up a bit.
Sure.
And to have people, as I mentioned the phrase, get out of their comfort zone to realize that the world going forward was going to look differently. So we started to describe an exercise, and the exercise was about creating these videos that we wanted the leaders to be able to illustrate to the organization. What did it mean to be decisive? What did it mean to be risk-taking? What did it mean to be customer focused?
Right.
And one of the leaders said to me and said, Mary, we can't do these things. We can't put these leaders in a position where they're going to be embarrassed.
Right.
That just won't work. And I remember my direct client looking at me like, okay, how are you how are you going to do this? But somehow you get the courage and also the intelligence to know when to push and when not to push. So
Sure.
I said to him, well, why don't we give people an option?
Yeah.
They can either pick creating a film, and I didn't call it this, or they can do a talking head video as they're maybe more comfortable with. And it was interesting because not one leader picked the talking head video, right? Everyone wanted to be part of creating this film. We had an Academy Award night and everything, but it just reminded me, as consultants, a lot of times, right, we just have to have the courage of our convictions, and we know that that's the right way. So that was some initial challenges, getting people to really accept, the leaders to accept that they needed to maybe put themselves a little bit at risk, that there may be the risk of looking a little bit foolish.
Sure. Yeah.
That was okay.
Right. It brings me to sort of two questions related to what you just mentioned. Now, you mentioned them making films. Was it them making films and how they're going to be more decisive in the future, or what was the film about?
Yeah,
That's question number one.
Each team was assigned one of the cultural attributes.
Right.
And they had to then create a film of what that looked like. So we were at this beautiful lake resort in northern Germany. So they had, it was a beautiful May week. So they had that as their playground. And, we were doing it professionally, in that we had professional videographers. So these weren't like it was actually before iPhone. So it was before that anyway. So we had support for them to do it. And I remember actually the one leader who pushed back on me, his film had him jumping into the lake as an example of taking a risk.
Right.
And one of the things that we also did was we created a book of the 3-day experience.
Sure.
So at the end of it, each leader with a signed note from the CEO got a book that kind of documented what they had been through. So we're really starting to kind of create these artifacts of how do we think about culture? How do we start to embed culture, institutionalize culture?
Right. That's a great example. So do you think because people participated, because these leaders were engaged in the process, that it made the success much easier to get compared to where a lot of the other integrations was a very hands-off approach, and people are just essentially asked to adopt new values? What's your take?
Absolutely. I would say that every culture project that I worked on, where the leaders spent a significant amount of their time talking about culture, wrestling with what does this really mean? We can say be decisive, but when we start to say, well, does that mean this person can sign off on a $10,000, investment
Sure.
or purchase, to really get them to understand, so they weren't just saying the words, but they understood what it meant. And I think that's key. And as I said, in every culture project that I would say went well,
Yeah.
one, it got the leaders involved, but they also spent a lot of time. And I think for a CEO to say, we're going to spend 3 days on this, or we're going to spend every meeting we have talking about culture,
Right.
also signifies to the other leaders that this matters.
Right. Right. Now, every culture, let's say cultural change that I've seen or I've heard others from others, there usually is a business reason, right? So you mentioned about being decisive. Now, what business outcome that being decisive drove? Was that cost optimization? Was that innovation? Was that new revenue opportunities? I mean, by expediting the decision making, what happened?
It was about innovation, right? And it was about, again, being that they were having this shift in this in strategy, the understanding that in order to get ideas to market, in order to get out in front of their customers more easily, that they needed to move more quickly, right? So they were training people as well on new products, and they couldn't just wait, right? They had to be running the business as they were going through this integration. So if
Sure.
they waited for people to feel 100% comfortable with, with the new way of doing things, that it would have slowed them up. So if they were coming up with new products, they were coming up with new relationships, with their customers, and they needed people just to go and do it, right? To
Right.
feel like they had the authority just to go and do it.
Right, right. Now that's a great story, and I'm sure our audience and viewers would love that. When now this has been a good few years since you had experienced this particular cultural integration, and since then I'm sure you've also realized a lot more about how culture works and what are some of the challenges culture faces in an integration. If you were to advise people and help them to get started on this culture journey, what would you advise them, and what would be a good starting point for these companies?
I think a good starting point is right from the beginning. And I think you can see, even in the management presentation stages, how these leaders behave,
Right,
even from the sense of who shows up for the meeting,
right,
and recognizing that there are limits in terms of who needs to be involved, but
sure,
who gets to speak. I remember when I was with the smaller client that I was working with, that they realized very early in the management presentations and in those early interactions that their chief financial officer of the company being acquired was probably not going to be a fit. And when I asked them, like, well, what did you pick up so early? And they said all of the questions were about him. What was going to
right,
happen to him? What was going to happen to his stock? And he
right,
said there were no questions about his employees. And
right,
he said that was, like, for us, the early sign, like, this is not the kind of leader that we want,
sure,
regardless of all of his, public CFO experience. We didn't want that type of leader in our organization.
right,
So I think if you're attuned to not just what's being said, but how's it being said, those early interactions. I also think in the due diligence, right, we can pick up so much just by looking at comp data, right?
sure,
How
yeah,
are
exactly,
things organized, like how many levels are there, and just start to understand very early on. But you need to have that the deal team believing that those things, and even if we're not acting on them, just starting to paint that picture
right.
of what that organization is going to be like. What are the things that we might want to pay attention to sooner rather than later?
Right, right. So that's interesting. Comp data, I know what you mean, but I'm sure there are people who want to know more about this. So what would you look at in the comp data that will enforce a cultural element?
Well, I think you can look at, for example, how many levels are there in the organization, or you
Sure.
start to get a sense of that. You can also look at what the how rewards are distributed, right? Is everyone on a bonus? some
Right.
sort. Is everyone rewarded for their extra effort in some way? So that starts to give you, again, a sense of not just the culture and that everyone is viewed as part of that organization, but is there that owner mentality of we're all committed to the success of the organization.
Right.
So that's just some of the ways that you can start to look at, who gets stock options. So you just start to look at how, not just what the compensation data is, but how is it distributed in the organization.
Sure, sure. Now, you've lived both as a consultant as well as worked for a company, an acquiring company. What do you see are the differences? Because one of the areas that we've heard time and again, companies talk about that there is an assessment done on the acquired company, but seldom on the acquiring company. And yet, as a consultant, you probably will see both sides. But if you're part of an acquiring company, you probably don't do an assessment in many cases. What has been your experience? And maybe do a bit of compare and contrast by bringing in a consultant versus somebody in-house.
Yeah. So by assessment, I'm assuming that you're talking about a cultural assessment.
That's right.
And we've always only, in my experience, done an assessment where we included both. Right.
Right. Okay.
You have to be able to draw comparisons.
Correct.
Right. You have to be able to show the context. And I think it also just shows sometimes where the acquired company may be stronger in some elements that you want
Right.
than you yourself. So I think it does bring up that contrast to it. But I also think, and I'm a strong proponent of doing assessments because I think they not only give us some data and insights, but they help people to understand the importance of it. And employees, the leaders, like the fact that they're being asked these questions, right? They're feeling like they're part of the process. But I don't think we can depend just on the survey. And that's where I think executive interviews, focus groups, I'm a big fan of ethnography, of being able to observe how people react. And one of the situations that really brought this to light for me and around was we were working with 2 insurance companies.
Right.
And one was in the Midwest, very traditional, very bureaucratic, very hierarchical. The other one was an East Coast, and the CEO prided himself on this empowered organization that he had created. So we did the surveys and we just did the leaders and above, the vice presidents and above, and it confirmed the story on both sides, the perceptions on both sides. But then we did the focus groups and we started to talk to employees, and the East Coast company with the CEO who felt like he had this empowered organization, what we heard from them was that only people were empowered to the vice president level, but below that, their directors, their managers operated in a much more autocratic fashion.
Sure.
So then we bring this to the attention of the 2 CEOs. We fed them their data back separately, and the East Coast CEO just stopped the project. He said, there's got to be something wrong with your methodology. This isn't the company that I run. And what we tried to delicately tell him was, you're getting information from the vice presidents and above.
That's right.
But you're not really hearing what's happening on the ground floor.
Yeah.
So I think assessments can help. They pointed us in some directions of exploration, but you can't just depend on them to tell you the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, a great example, because this is one of the aspects, one of the factors that we call out, the leadership styles, right? Because literally, as you pointed out, you probably have an alpha male. I mean, if I may still use that term, as a CEO, and very outgoing, very extrovert, and surrounded by the CEO thinks they're the right kind of people, but probably is the yes sir or yes ma'am kind of people. Quite often don't see the culture beyond their direct reports. And that's a great example. Thanks for sharing that. Moving on, and I was just looking at the clock. It's we're approaching the towards the end of it. But before we go, a couple of questions. First is, over the years, I'm sure you have seen some good practices. You may have used some good tools or methodologies. Are there some that you may want to highlight or underscore? And they don't have to be necessarily culture, but human capital or M&A in general. Are there some tools and techniques?
Um, I often find that sometimes the simplest tool can have the most power. So I was working with a life science company, and we got started a little bit late, but we went through the processes that we've talked about of doing the surveys, doing the assessment, designing what the new culture was going to be in this organization. But one of the things that we did was we created a decision tool that took each of the cultural attributes and asked some questions so that as the integration teams were making decisions, they could test it against these cultural attributes. And one of the cultural attributes, again, was customer focus.
Right.
And what we found that the team that was working on HR policies, when they used that tool, they realized that they were going to change a policy that people could opt out or opt into a new job after 1 year in their current job. What they realized by going through this tool and questioning, they realized that that was a great decision for employees. It was a terrible decision for their customers, because it took the employees at least a year to understand that client.
Sure.
And to then not be able to have somebody new come in was not going to be good in the best interest of the customers. And that wasn't true for everyone, but they had to have a policy that was consistent. So I found that tool just by having people pause and say, okay, we're making this decision about the integration.
Right.
Is it aligned with our culture, with where we're going? And let's just ask ourselves some questions before we move forward with that decision. And not every decision, right? So you pick the big impactful ones.
Right.
But that simple tool, the head of integration, who was not an HR person, right, as a business person, said that that was the most important tool that they used throughout their integration process. Again, it was 1 page, 5 cultural attributes, 2 or 3 questions around each one, but it started to have them think about their decisions and what the impact was going to be both on employees and on their customers.
Brilliant, brilliant. Couple of examples of what's the nastiest thing that you've seen when it comes to M&A integration? And then obviously we want a positive side or a positive.
Oh boy, the nastiest thing I've seen in M&A integration. When the leaders show that they don't care about people, and I'll always remember one CEO saying on day 1 that the integration was over, because from his perspective it was.
Right.
And I don't have one particular story, but when you don't realize what's happening, that employees need time, like you've been dealing with this transaction maybe for years, right? Going after it. So for you, you're done, right? Your job is done as a senior leader. But for the employees, it's just
started.
It's just beginning.
Yeah. Okay. And what's maybe one of the best examples or behaviors that you saw?
I'd have to go back to the chief operating officer for the company that I then went to work for, the specialty pharmaceutical company that I went to work for, where he moved across country and spent his time walking the halls every day, talking to people. And this was an East Coast company, very traditional, family-owned, 6th generation, who bought this biotech firm and company in Palo Alto. I'd never seen more bottles of vodka in an HR closet than I saw there, because that was their nature at Friday parties and things of that nature. But they were really jolted by this acquisition, because they were a publicly traded company. Everyone was invested in the stock when this new product was going to be launched. So it really had a jolt. And they were also people who were tied geographically to California. But we had to make them feel part of the family. And the COO just went out there and just lived there and created such trust and such goodwill by getting to know people and just leading in the cafeteria and just the way that he was. And that, again, that's a leader taking accountability for the success of the transaction. I don't expect that every leader should do that, But I think particularly when you're acquiring a smaller company, to have that visible presence can really matter.
Gotcha. I think we have time for just a couple of questions, personal questions. Favorite business books?
Well, I have to plug my friends who have books that came out this year, and one is
Right.
Melissa Swift, who wrote a book called Work Here Now, and these are all about the future of work. So she talks about what's wrong with organizations in terms of how the humanness of those organizations. And another one is a colleague of mine, Anna Tavis and Stella Lupashore, who wrote a book called Humans at Work. So these books, I really think, just help us think differently about organizations. And I also think they help us think about M&A, right? So when we're
Right.
going in, that we're talking about humans, we're talking about people's lives who are affected by. So those are two books that I've recently read that just really resonated with me.
Sure. We're going to put the description of those books in the show notes. One last question. How has this career, and you've been a consultant, you started as an organizational psychologist, and now you teach people, you teach business leaders. If you were to reflect back your last 20 years or 25, 30 years, whatever it is, maybe just sum it up, and that could be the last question of the evening.
Well, that's a great setup, and we didn't plan this, but I'll plug my own book, which I just finished writing,
Right.
called Courage, Curiosity, and Compassion, the Superpowers of a Consultant. And for me, it's been to have a career that you just love. But one of the things that I loved about it was the people that I met.
Right.
And the generosity that I think people in this field, and the clients that I did M&A work for are lifelong friends, because you're in the trenches with them. It's
That's
so
right.
emotional. It uses all of my psychological training. But I think it's really about the relationships, and to have a career where you not only have these lifelong relationships and have done work that's meaningful and has had a positive impact, but now to be able to share it with my students, I couldn't feel more blessed.
Sure. I was trying to find a way to ask you that question without necessarily asking you about your book. So that's why maybe people have heard me fumble on that question.
Well, when I get it published, you can have me back again. So.
Right. Absolutely. Mary, it was a pleasure. I got to learn a lot from you. So thank you so much for taking out your time and
You're
sharing
welcome.
your
What
journey.
a great way to start my day. Thank you so much.
Did you like today's content? If yes, then don't forget to hit the like button. If you heard something interesting, then don't forget to share it with your network and friends. And last but not least, please support us on this journey to spread awareness on topics related to M&A and integration by subscribing to our channel. That's all for now. Stay healthy and see you next time.
And if you like this session, I'm sure you'll also like our latest new tool. It is a quick assessment scorecard to assess the robustness of your culture integration capabilities in M&A. It just takes less than 5 minutes to answer. It is for free and you get instantaneous assessment. So visit culturema.scoreapp.com. That's culturema.scoreapp.com and find out for yourself.
I hope you guys enjoyed the show today. This show was sponsored by Fifth Chrome, a business strategy advisor in a training company specializing in M&A, post-merger integration, and business strategy.